Today we're going to take a short break from catastrophizing and we're going to talk about something else. We're going to have a brief history of being homeless in the countryside. I can't remember where I got the idea for this from, it was probably something in the Discord. But a little bit before my time, tramps were a thing. These were homeless people that would roam around the countryside, maybe with a trolley or a pram with their possessions in. And in doing so, they would interact with farmers and occasionally sleep in barns and stuff like that. And there was one that used to have a round he walked a few times a year that came past our farm, and my grandfather gave him an old piece of plastic silage sheet once, which apparently he was over the moon about. But this is a fairly interesting topic because Britain has a very rich history of being homeless in the countryside, but it's a history that has now ended. Homelessness is more of an urban thing now. One thing I've learnt while researching this is that people rarely draw or photograph homeless people. Some of the pictures I'm using today might be a bit of a stretch, but we can use our imagination. Going back a long time, you got hermits. This, I understand, has some Celtic origins, but when Christianity was introduced to Britain, they let it continue. Christian hermits existed across Europe and the Middle East too. There's also a story that when St. Augustine arrived in Kent to convert Britain to Christianity in the year 597, he met a hermit who helped him talk to King Ethelbert's court underneath a tree. Hermits would typically live in solitude, either attached to a monastery or just sort of on their own. They would forage for fish or keep what we would call a garden or maybe some small livestock. One in Ireland lived in this little hole called St. Kevin's Bed. Later in the Norman period, the practice of being a hermit became a bit more formalised, so hermits could be licensed by the church and receive support. They might be sponsored in return for prayers or just serve some basic economic function that involved staying in a remote place, like looking after a bridge or taking tolls for roads. This deliberate and noble homelessness was killed off when Henry VIII shut down all the monasteries. But being a hermit had a romantic resurgence in the 18th and 19th centuries, where landowners would hire ornamental hermits to give their gardens a flavour of melancholy charm. They would pay people to live in hovels in the grounds of their houses for the sake of a bit of whimsy. As with most rural cultural reconstruction, I think this is obviously top down and probably misses the point of being a hermit somewhat, if it's being done for show. Other homeless people in the medieval period were probably a bit more mobile. You might get peasants who had escaped from their parish. Such people were probably anonymous and had lost their lord, so would wander around until somebody let them stay. After the Black Death, labour became more scarce, so there was a bit more movement as people could look for a lord that might treat them a bit better. People also moved to escape the Black Death, and a lot of villages in my area in the Midlands got small satellite settlements, often called Little London. Here's a settlement on the road into my village on a 1919 map. But these homeless and mobile people might have received charity from the monasteries before they were shut down. This meant that when the open fields were enclosed and the peasants who didn't have enough land to make a viable farm became dispossessed, they didn't have the monasteries to look after them. This is the birth of the landless labourer, which happens just as landowners decided to abandon labour-intensive cultivation in favour of much more profitable sheep farming in many places. This process made people in the countryside homeless. The Tudors dealt with this by making it illegal to be homeless, and they would punish vagabonds by branding them or putting them in workhouses. Even though enclosure was starting to happen, the government couldn't shake the idea that peasants are supposed to be from a place. As the Tudor period went on, punishments for being consistently homeless developed from being put in stocks for 3 days before being sent back to where you came from, getting a letter V branded on your chest, to being enslaved for 2 years, and later to being hung. From the late 16th century, poor laws emerged which made parishes responsible for looking after the poor. You got almshouses and workhouses, but in order for this to work, people had to stay within their parish, so moving around if you were poor was still discouraged. But people in a parish would all know each other, and looking after people cost money, so if you weren't from a place or you hadn't worked there long enough to make looking after you worth it, then you'd probably just be sent somewhere else anyway. But if the rural homeless couldn't get help through the poor law, they could now start going to towns or doing seasonal labour. Artisans like carpenters, tailors, shoemakers and tinkerers might travel from village to village looking for short-term employment. These might be people between jobs, or they might just move from place to place, as it was quite a good way of providing services in places they weren't needed all the time. Eventually, trade guilds and charitable societies would start to organise lodgings for these people. And as these people were professionals, they were not quite vagabonds, but often had to have licenses to prove that they were not just homeless. Some of them also moved things around, like livestock in the droving trade we talked about ages ago. You can see this drover has a license sewn into his clothing to prove to the authorities that he's not homeless. Other people might buy stuff from farmers and resell them elsewhere. Although arguably a mercantile profession, this made peddlars a threat to established settled shops. It was treading a fine line between enterprise and homelessness. By the mid-19th century, being homeless is once again almost universally frowned upon in the way it was in the Tudor times. Allegedly, this movement was widespread enough that language and signs were developed to be etched on buildings or on roads to communicate with other tramps about what to expect from a place, about whether to tell the inhabitants a good story to get somewhere with them, or if they were likely to call the police. This may just be folklore though, as if a tramp was to find a very generous household, that was valuable information and he would best keep it to himself. This group of people then morph into tramps, as we would understand today, people without long-term employment who are just wandering around the countryside. These tramps would often have a route they walked, so farmers would see them a few times a year. And some nights they might want shelter, and sometimes farmers had something they wanted someone to keep an eye on overnight. So there were some advantages to letting a tramp stay in your barn. He'd be in there if anyone was to come in to steal anything. The articles I found about this suggested farmers would generally let tramps sleep in the barns, but they often confiscated any matches the tramps had and gave them back the next day. I think this shows quite a polite, permissive interaction in that the tramps asked to stay in the barn, but also not complete trust. Today it might seem a bit degrading to make people sleep in barns, but in some instances it might not have been that much worse than houses. There was bedding available and the animals would probably keep the place fairly warm in a way that wouldn't be true of houses. And for that reason, throughout Europe there have been houses that kept animals downstairs while the people lived above them. Living with animals has had benefits. Some people in the countryside have also been homeless even if they didn't move around very much. My great-grandfather was a contractor during the Second World War, and the story goes he used to employ someone who lived in a chair in the corner of the pub that the landlord let him sleep in. But when the pub was redecorated, he had to sleep in the barn for a bit. Tramps in the modern mind seem to be remembered quite favourably, in contrast to urban homelessness, akin much more to the medieval hermit than the Tudor vagabond. I found an online forum asking about them, and people were describing tramps as having a simple and gentle life, homeless but not addicted or nefarious or criminal, wandering around the countryside doing no harm to any locals at all, which seems to be more or less how my family remember them. Another person described them as honest and carefree, musing that the rural tramp was a lifestyle. It was a choice and not a product of social ills. That is probably a fair point, because tramping has declined terminally since the introduction of the welfare state after the Second World War. There's not much reason to do it anymore. So perhaps the last generation of tramps were people without earthly desire who were drawn to a nomadic, solitary existence. But I say that as a suggestion. I am of course aware that it's quite easy to become homeless without safety nets. But it is certainly true that these people are viewed favourably. I found a BBC article about an 83-year-old tramp living beside a ring road in Wolverhampton, and the locals brought him food, and social services got the army to replace his tent with a better one, which he didn't seem to like very much. I think society does care for these people. The other thing I noticed when reading about this is that it's a very male thing. Tramps are men, vagabonds are men. What happens to women when they become homeless? Some of the images I found suggested, as you would expect, that families went on the tramp, but perhaps for safety or to look after children, women were more likely to tolerate life in a workhouse, while the men inclined to the life of the tramp would choose that instead. I don't know. I think for the reasons that someone might keep an ornamental hermit, it's a bit of a shame that we no longer have people wandering around the countryside telling stories in exchange for sleeping in a barn, just to put a bit of life in the place. But maybe in saying that, I am myself indulging in paternalistic fantasy, because of course I myself would not like to be a tramp. If you have any tramp stories, drop them below. We love that stuff. Do subscribe and come back next week when we'll talk about something a bit more pressing.